It has been too long, but let's talk some more history. Greetings, citizens of Nerdicopia, I'm your princess, Judith. It's been a while, because it's always been a while these days, but it's finally time to continue our journey through the history of brave little Belgium. Anyone know where we left off? Right, the Treaty of Utrecht and the transfer of the southern Low Countries from Spanish rule to Austrian rule. Gonna be honest, this is not a period that I know very well. So what happened there? Well, we need to go back to 1700 of the Common Era, when the King of Spain died without an heir. And historically, that's not good. That's gonna cause conflict, and in this case, the War of Succession was between France and the Austrian line of the Habsburgs, and some allies. I'm not gonna go into it, because this show is not about war, so if you want to know more, say it with me, ask your local history teacher. Long story short, they agreed to redistribute the areas that the Spanish crown had ruled over, and for us that means that the southern Low Countries went to the Austrian Habsburgs. The thing about that is that also part of the coalition of the Austrians, so someone who would also benefit when they get the Low Countries, was William III of Orange. Will was a descendant of William of Orange, unifier of the Dutch Republic, and Willie III also just so happened to be married to Mary II, Queen of the UK. So that's a lot of people who don't like France and don't care that much about these parts of the world. Basically, the southern Low Countries became a barrier to protect the Republic and Austria against France. That's not some kind of conspiracy, that's literally what happened. In 1715, the so-called barrier treaties allowed the Dutch Republic to station armies in the southern Low Countries to protect against France. And I can't wait to get a better name to refer to this area, because that's a mouthful. Now, what happens next doesn't really help us with the name, but it does make things a bit more manageable, in theory. In 1713, the Austrian Emperor, Charles VI, issued something called the Pragmatic Sanction, which made it so that the Habsburg region, like the land they rule, becomes one inseparable unit, and also it abolished male primogeniture. So now he could be succeeded by his oldest child, regardless of their gender, which is still primogeniture, but at least they're not sexist anymore, right? Right? Oh, come on! Of course they were. It took until 1748, that's 35 years later, before Maria Theresia, Charlie's successor, was actually accepted. They had a whole war of succession over it, because humans are exhausting. I won't go into it, ask your local history teacher. What does need to be said though, is that as a result of this war of succession, France invaded and took over for a bit. That is until 1748, when they kinda just restored the situation and became allies. So this rearranged balance of power in Europe, and Maria Theresia centralized her government in Vienna. Not unlike the Spanish, she did appoint a government to lay down the law on site. This governor was generally someone related to the emperor, like Maria Elizabeth or Charles of Lorraine, respectively Maria Theresia's aunt or brother-in-law. And just to make sure the governor wouldn't get any ideas of independence, there was also a minister plenipotentiary, which is like the first minister. This is getting ridiculous. So that new balance of the European power did mean that they were able to focus on internal developments. The Habsburgs built more and better roads and highways to connect cities and facilitate trade, and of course communication with that central government. Free trade as a principle also became more and more important. Before that, there was this thing called protectionism or mercantilism, which is the policy of protecting the national economy by keeping out imports, for example with tariffs. So that was dialed back under the Austrian Habsburgs. There were also innovations in agriculture, for example potatoes. Potatoes are pretty dang important. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew, or of course fries. I'm not saying this is when fries were invented, but it won't be too long. Another pretty big thing in this period is the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Some guy in the UK, Thomas Newcomen, invented a machine that allows to pump mines dry, which led to a boom of mines in Bologna. We're not getting like steam machines and big factories to kill the employees yet, but these are the beginnings. Maria Theresia, and even more so her son Joseph too, ruled in a style that's called enlightened absolutism, basically combining the ideals of the Enlightenment with absolute monarchic rule. In short, I'm the boss, not the church, not nobles, not anyone else. But I am gonna be enlightened about it. For example, Joseph gave Jews and Protestants full citizenship and freedom of religion. So they made a bunch of reforms that took away power from the locals, including guilds, as well as the church. So basically, I think they just upset just about everyone. Which brings us to an episode known as the Brabantse Omwenteling, or the Brabantine Revolution. What happened was, the states of Brabant had a charter that they considered kind of like their constitution, die blijde inkomst, and Joseph had promised to maintain that charter, and then he didn't. His reforms went directly against the charter, and the people didn't like that. By the way, this is pretty much the same reason the northern Low Countries revolted against Philip II a century or two earlier. In fact, they formed civil militias, and a lawyer called Hendrik van der Noot wrote a memorandum saying that this was bad and that Joseph failed to be a good ruler. So the governors were like, okay, sorry, our bad, undo. And the emperor was like, sorry, what? And so in May of 1787, the governors were replaced and the reforms, except the ones concerning the church, were undone. But that is not the Brabantine Revolution. That's just a small revolution. After all this, Van der Noot, the guy who called out Joseph for being a bad ruler, got scared and ran away. And the rest of the opposition only got worse for Joseph. They started planning a real armed revolution. In 1789, that's the first year of the French Revolution, while Van der Noot was on sabbatical, I guess, there was a secret society formed, led by Jan Frans Vonk and Jan Baptist Verlooy, also lawyers, called Pro Aris et Focis, or For Altar and Hearth. They started actually planning the uprising by collecting funds, getting weapons, and they appointed Jan Andries van der Meers to lead the militia. That's a lot of Jans. In October 1789, they went for it, and before Christmas, they freed the country. This is where it gets messy, because the rebellion polarized into a group of conservatives led by Van der Noot, who just wanted to restore the blijde inkomst charter, and a group led by Vonk, who wanted to actually implement the ideals of the Enlightenment, just without any absolute monarch. But the first group, the conservatives, kinda commandeered the revolution and banished Vonk and his friends. Now at the time, they didn't call it the Brabantine Revolution. They just called it the Belgian Revolution, because these people were well read. They knew their Caesar. We just don't call it that anymore because you'll see. And so in January 1790, they founded Les États Belgiques Unis, or the United Belgian States. Basically what this was a confederacy of states, more or less provinces now, with an overarching States General to rule them all. For the daily business, they created the Sovereign Congress, but really the ruling was done by Van der Noort and the State Secretary. And they kinda just restored the whole system as the Blad Inkomst described it. Spoiler alert, it didn't last long. Austria tried to get the area back, and the Belgian states didn't manage to get any alliances with the big countries that could help them. In fact, they all allied with Austria, mostly against Napoleon, but a little perk for Austria was that they'd also help to get the Low Countries back. Or at least, they weren't gonna get in the way, provided that the emperor respected the Blad Inkomst this time. And so, the southern Low Countries were once again Austrian. Hey, remember how this episode started with France and Austria fighting over the southern Low Countries? We've had so many revolutions, we went full circle. France is now a republic, I think still first, and they want to expand, for some reason. Manifest Destiny, Lebensraum, something along those lines, probably. Anyway, the French conquer the southern Low Countries. Initially Austria gets them back, but in the words of Bob Hale, not for long. So for the foreseeable future, the southern Low Countries are French provinces. Obviously we can go on, but that's a story for another day. Which brings me to the YouTube thing. You know the drill. Everything you can do to help the channel is in the end screen right here. Any questions or corrections are of course welcome down below. And if you don't know what to comment, how about this? What should I talk about next time? More history? More role-playing shenanigans? More fandom? Any specific topics or questions you desperately want my input on for some reason? Let me know down below. For now, thanks for watching.